The heat rose in shimmering waves from the pierced steel planking of Wewak Airfield as Captain Yoshio Fukui walked the length of the damaged American fighter. It was the morning of November 12, 1943, and the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt before him represented something he had not expected to see intact on New Guinea soil. The aircraft had come down 3 days earlier, wheels up in the kunai grass north of the runway, its pilot already dead from wounds sustained in the running fight that had brought him to Earth. Fukui's orders from the Aviation Technical Research Institute in Tokyo were explicit. Document everything, photograph the construction, estimate the battle damage, and prepare a preliminary assessment of American fighter doctrine in the Southwest Pacific. What troubled him was not the aircraft's presence. Shot-down American planes were becoming more common as General Kenny's 5th Air Force expanded its operations from Port Moresby. What troubled him was the précaire condition of the wreckage. Fukui counted the entry holes methodically, marking each with a piece of chalk as his assistant recorded the tally in a worn notebook. 20mm cannon strikes from what appeared to be multiple passes by Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters. 30 caliber machine gun impacts scattered across the wings and fuselage. Several larger holes that suggested hits from the heavier weapons mounted on Japanese bombers defending themselves during whatever engagement had brought this aircraft down. The American pilot had been hit multiple times as well. Fukui had examined the blood-stained cockpit the previous afternoon, but the aircraft itself had continued flying for what intelligence reports suggested was another 40 kilometers before the pilot's strength gave out. This was the third P-47 that Japanese forces had recovered in the theatre, but it was the first that Fukui had been able to examine in detail before scavengers stripped it for salvage or Allied bombing, rendered it unrecognizable. He ran his hand along the cowling, feeling the thickness of the metal, noting how the 18-cylinder radial engine sat behind armor plating that appeared to be at least half an inch thick. The Americans had built this fighter with a design philosophy that seemed wasteful, even absurd, given what Fukui had been taught about aerial combat. The aircraft weighed more than 4,000 kilograms, empty nearly twice the weight of the Ki-43 that most of his countrymen flew. It carried 8 heavy machine guns when Japanese doctrine suggested that 2 or 4 were sufficient. Its fuel tanks were self-sealing, a feature that added weight but prevented the catastrophic fires that claimed so many Japanese pilots when their lighter aircraft were hit. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Fukui had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force Academy in 1937 with honors in aircraft engineering. His training had emphasized the principles that had guided Japanese aviation for more than a decade: maneuverability above all else, climb rate as the decisive advantage, weight reduction to achieve maximum agility in the turning fight that Japanese doctrine considered inevitable. The Zero fighter that dominated the Navy's carrier forces embodied these principles perfectly. So did the Army's Ki-43, which could outturn any Allied fighter at low to medium altitude. Japanese pilots were taught that superior skill and tactical cunning would overcome any material disadvantage. The spirit of Bushido, channeled through the control stick, would triumph over the crude engineering of Western nations that relied on brute force rather than elegance. The P-47 before him represented the antithesis of everything Fukui had learned. It was heavy where Japanese fighters were light. It was armored where Japanese fighters prioritized speed through minimal protection. It carried provisions for pilot survival: the thick armor plate behind the seat, the reinforced canopy frame, the redundant control systems that Japanese engineers considered an admission of weakness. A true warrior, as Fukui had been taught, did not need such crutches. A true warrior relied on skill to avoid being hit in the first place. But the evidence before him told a different story. The pilot of this aircraft had been hit repeatedly, hit by weapons that would have sent a Ki-43 tumbling from the sky in flames. And yet the P-47 had kept flying. Its engine, despite taking what appeared to be multiple strikes to the cowling area, had continued producing power. Its controls, though damaged, had remained functional enough for the dying pilot to maintain altitude for another 40 kilometers. The aircraft had not burned, had not broken apart, had not failed in any of the catastrophic ways that Japanese fighters failed when subjected to similar punishment. Fukui made a note in his own observation journal, separate from the official report he would file with Tokyo. American design priorities appear inverted from our own doctrine. Where we maximize performance through weight reduction and maneuverability, they maximize survivability through redundancy and protection. Initial assessment. This represents not inferior engineering, but a fundamentally different conception of air combat. Further investigation required to understand strategic implications. The November sun was reaching its apex when Fukui climbed into the damaged cockpit, careful not to disturb the dried blood on the seat. He wanted to understand what the American pilot had experienced in those final minutes of flight. The instrument panel, though cracked and bullet-scarred, remained largely intact. The throttle quadrant showed the expected controls for a supercharged radial engine, but with additional levers, whose purpose Fukui could only guess. The control stick was positioned for a pilot wearing thick gloves and heavy clothing. American pilots, intelligence reports suggested, flew at altitudes where Japanese pilots would have long since succumbed to hypoxia, protected by oxygen systems and heated flight suits that added even more weight to their aircraft. He thought about the reports coming in from fighter units across New Guinea. The 348th Fighter Group of the American 5th Air Force had begun operations with P-47 seconds in July of that year, just 4 months earlier. Initial Japanese intelligence assessments had been dismissive. The Thunderbolt, as the Americans called it, appeared poorly suited for Pacific combat. It could not match Japanese fighters in turning performance. It required long runways that the Americans did not always possess in their forward positions. Its range, initially limited by fuel consumption, seemed inadequate for the vast distances of the Southwest Pacific Theater. But Colonel Neil Kirby, the American commander, had developed tactics that exploited the P-47's actual strengths rather than trying to fight the way Japanese doctrine expected. The Thunderbolts would climb to high altitude 20,000 feet or higher, where the thin air gave their supercharged engines an advantage Japanese fighters could not match. They would approach Japanese airfields at Wewak or Rabaul from above, diving at tremendous speed to make a single pass with their 8 machine guns, then using that speed to climb back to altitude before Japanese fighters could react. The tactic was devastatingly effective. Between August and December of that year, the 348th Fighter Group would claim over 150 victories, while losing only 8 pilots. Kirby himself would become an ace, shooting down 6 Japanese aircraft in a single engagement on October 11th. Japanese pilots who survived encounters with P-47 seconds reported similar experiences. The American fighters were difficult to pursue in a dive. They accelerated to speeds that Japanese aircraft could not safely match. They were nearly impossible to shoot down with the lighter armament most Japanese fighters carried. Even when hit, they frequently escaped, trailing smoke but still under control, heading back toward Allied airfields, where ground crews would somehow patch them up and return them to combat. One report that had crossed Fukui's desk described a P-47 that had been hit by multiple 20mm cannon rounds during a fight over Finchhafen, leaving visible holes in the wings and fuselage. The aircraft had continued fighting, shooting down one Ki-43 before departing the area. It had been seen again 2 days later, flying another mission, the holes patched with what appeared to be sheet metal and rivets. This was incomprehensible within the framework of Japanese aviation doctrine. An aircraft that sustained such damage should not fly. A pilot who had been wounded should not continue the mission. The very possibility of survival after taking hits represented a failure of warrior spirit. True warriors did not plan for defeat by armoring themselves against it, and yet the Americans were surviving. Not just surviving, but returning to inflict further losses on Japanese forces that could ill afford them. Fukui climbed down from the cockpit and walked to the engine. His assistant had managed to remove several of the cowling panels, revealing the massive Pratt & Whitney R 2800 radial engine beneath. 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, air-cooled, producing 2,000 horsepower at takeoff. The engine had taken at least 3 hits that Fukui could see, punching through cooling fins and cracking cylinder heads, but it had not seized, had not caught fire, had not failed. Japanese radial engines of comparable size, and there were few required careful maintenance and precise operating procedures. They ran hot and could not tolerate damage. This American engine looked as though it had been designed with the assumption that it would be shot and had been built rugged enough to keep running anyway. He found the armor plating behind the pilot's seat and measured it carefully. 12 millimeters of hardened steel, angled to deflect rounds coming from behind and below. Japanese fighters, even the newer models being rushed into production, carried no such protection. The philosophy was clear. Armor added weight. Weight reduced performance. Reduced performance meant death in combat. Therefore, armor caused death rather than prevented it. But here was evidence that challenged that logic. The American pilot had been protected by the armor. He had been hit. He had died anyway, from wounds to his arms and legs where the armor did not cover, but he had lived long enough to fly 40 more kilometers. Long enough, perhaps, to radio his position, to give intelligence about Japanese defenses, to deny the enemy a prisoner who might have been interrogated for information. The sun was descending toward the horizon when Fukui completed his initial survey. He had filled 3 notebooks with measurements, sketches, and observations. His assistant had exposed 4 rolls of film, documenting every detail of the aircraft's construction. Tomorrow they would begin the process of disassembling the engine for shipment to the Technical Research Institute in Tokyo, where engineers with better equipment and more time could analyze its design in detail. But Fukui already knew what his preliminary report would conclude. The Americans had developed a fighter that reflected a fundamentally different conception of aerial warfare, one that prioritized pilot survival and sustained operations over the elegant turning combat that Japanese doctrine considered decisive. What Fukui could not yet articulate, standing in the fading light beside the wrecked P-47, was the deeper implication of what he had discovered. The armor, the redundant systems, the massive engine, the 8 heavy machine guns, all of these represented a military-industrial complex that could afford to add weight because it had the manufacturing capacity to build enough aircraft anyway. Japanese factories were struggling to produce the lighter, simpler aircraft that doctrine demanded. American factories were producing fighters that weighed twice as much and incorporating features that Japanese engineers would have considered luxuries. The difference was not in engineering skill or design philosophy alone. The difference was in industrial capacity, in the ability to build not just aircraft, but the entire infrastructure of modern war on a scale that Japan could not match. He thought of the intelligence reports he had read about American production figures. The numbers seemed fantastical, impossible, surely inflated by propaganda. The reports claimed that American factories were producing aircraft by the P-47, thousands every month. That new P-47 seconds were rolling off assembly lines in New York at a rate Japanese factories could not achieve if they ran continuously for a year. Fukui had dismissed these numbers as Allied psychological warfare, intended to demoralize Japanese forces by suggesting resistance was futile. But standing beside this single aircraft, examining its construction, he began to wonder if the numbers might be true. If America could afford to build fighters this heavy, this complex, this wastefully over-engineered by Japanese standards, then perhaps they truly were producing them in quantities that rendered Japanese production capacity irrelevant. The P-47 before him was not just a different aircraft. It was evidence of a different kind of war, one in which material abundance rather than warrior spirit determined outcomes, one in which industrial capacity rather than tactical brilliance decided victory, one in which Japan, for all the courage of its pilots and the skill of its engineers, might be facing an enemy whose advantages went far beyond anything Japanese propaganda had acknowledged. Fukui wrote one final note in his journal before leaving the airfield. This aircraft represents not a tactical challenge but a strategic revelation. Recommend urgent reassessment of production priorities and combat doctrine. American material advantages may exceed previous intelligence estimates by an order of magnitude. The report would be filed, routed through channels, and eventually reach officers in Tokyo who would read it with varying degrees of concern and disbelief. Some would dismiss Fukui's assessment as defeatist, incompatible with the fighting spirit expected of imperial forces. Others would recognize the truth in his observations, but feel powerless to change production realities that were driven by resource constraints rather than engineering choices. A few would understand that Fukui had identified a problem far larger than tactics or training could solve. Japan was engaged in a war of industrial attrition against an enemy whose capacity to produce weapons exceeded anything Japanese planners had anticipated. But that understanding would come later, as more P-47 seconds appeared in Pacific skies, as Japanese losses mounted. As the material disparity became undeniable, even to those most committed to the belief that spirit could overcome steel. In November of 1943, standing beside a bullet-riddled Thunderbolt on a jungle airfield in New Guinea, Captain Yoshio Fukui had his first clear glimpse of the truth that would define the Pacific War's final years. America was not just fighting differently. America was fighting from a position of material abundance that made Japanese notions of acceptable loss ratios and warrior spirit irrelevant to the war's ultimate outcome. The philosophy that shaped the P-47's design had its origins in lessons learned over European skies, far from the jungles of New Guinea, where Fukui examined its wreckage. In the spring of 1940, as German forces swept through France and the Battle of Britain loomed, American military observers in England were taking careful notes about what modern air combat actually required. The romantic notions of individual dogfighting skill, of lightweight fighters engaged in graceful aerial ballet, were being shattered by the brutal arithmetic of sustained operations. Aircraft that could not protect their pilots did not survive long enough for skill to matter. Fighters that caught fire when hit were removing trained aviators from the force structure faster than replacement pilots could be trained. Alexander Kartveli, the Republic aviation designer responsible for the P-47, had absorbed these lessons. His previous designs, the P-35 and P-43, had been conventional fighters that prioritized performance through reduced weight. But the specifications that emerged for what would become the Thunderbolt reflected a new understanding of air combat as a war of attrition in which pilot survival and sustained sortie rates mattered more than any individual engagement. The Army Air Corps wanted a fighter that could escort bombers to targets deep in enemy territory, engage defending fighters at high altitude, absorb battle damage, and return its pilot home to fly another mission. Kartveli designed the largest single-engine fighter of the war to meet those requirements. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that powered the P-47 produced 2,000 horsepower, making it one of the most powerful aviation engines in production anywhere in the world. But power alone was insufficient for the high-altitude performance the Army demanded. Kartveli added a turbocharger system, housed in the rear fuselage, that compressed thin, high-altitude air before feeding it to the engine. The system added complexity, weight, and cost. It required ducting that snaked from the nose of the aircraft back to the turbocharger and then forward again to the engine. Japanese engineers, reviewing intelligence about the P-47's design, could not understand why Americans would accept such complications when simpler solutions existed. The answer was that America could afford complexity. Its industrial base could manufacture precision turbocharged components. Its maintenance infrastructure could support complicated systems. Its resource base could sustain the fuel consumption such powerful engines demanded. The 8 Browning M2 machine guns represented a similar philosophy. Each gun weighed 64 pounds. Each required ammunition 400 rounds per gun in early P-47 variants, later reduced to 300 to save weight for other improvements. The total weight of guns and ammunition approached 1,000 kilograms, more than the empty weight of a Japanese Zero. Japanese doctrine considered 4 guns adequate, 2 guns sufficient for skilled pilots. 8 guns seemed excessive, wasteful, an admission that American pilots lacked the marksmanship to make aimed shots count. But in practice, the 8-gun armament meant that P-47 pilots could fire longer bursts, could saturate target areas rather than needing pinpoint accuracy, could damage enemy aircraft even with deflection shots that would have been worthless with lighter armament. The weight penalty was real, but in the American calculation, the tactical advantage justified it. The self-sealing fuel tanks added another 300 kilograms to the aircraft's weight. Japanese engineers considered them unnecessary. A properly flown aircraft should not be hit, and if hit, the pilot should accept his fate, rather than relying on mechanical protection. But American planners had different priorities. A pilot who survived being shot down represented months of training investment lost. A pilot who made it home despite fuel tank damage could fly tomorrow. Over the course of a sustained campaign, self-sealing tanks meant more pilots surviving, more experience, accumulating in squadron ranks, more veterans available to train new arrivals. The calculation was coldly pragmatic. The weight penalty was cheaper than the training cost of replacement pilots. By the time the first P-47 seconds reached England in late 1942, the aircraft that resulted from these design choices was enormous by fighter standards. It weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, more than 12,000 pounds loaded for combat. It required long runways for takeoff and landing, making it unsuitable for the short strips that characterized Pacific Island warfare. It climbed slowly at low altitude, making it vulnerable during the crucial moments after takeoff. American pilots accustomed to nimble fighters like the Spitfire took one look at the massive radial engine and nicknamed it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, a name that captured both its intimidating size and its people-stive, ponderous handling characteristics. But at altitude, the P-47 transformed. Above 25,000 feet, where its turbocharger gave the engine full power and where most enemy fighters struggled for performance, the Thunderbolt could outdive and outrun almost anything in the sky. It could maintain high speeds in combat, using energy tactics rather than turning combat to achieve kills. And when hit, it kept flying with a reliability that astonished pilots and intelligence analysts alike. The massive radial engine could sustain damage that would destroy liquid-cooled inline engines. The redundant control systems meant that severed cables did not render the aircraft unflyable. The armor protected pilots from the rear-quarter attacks that claimed so many lives in combat. Lieutenant Robert Johnson's experience on June 26, 1943, illustrated the P-47's survivability in the most dramatic possible terms. Flying escort for bombers returning from France, Johnson became separated from his formation during a fight with German Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds. One Focke 190, piloted by German ace Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, latched onto Johnson's tail and opened fire. 20mm cannon rounds ripped through the P-47's fuselage, smashing the canopy, destroying instruments, severing hydraulic lines. Johnson, wounded and partially blinded by hydraulic fluid, could only huddle behind his armor plate as Meyer made repeated firing passes. The German ace, frustrated by the American aircraft's refusal to fall from the sky, eventually exhausted his ammunition. He pulled alongside Johnson's battered P-47, examined the damage, and according to Johnson's account, saluted before breaking away. Johnson nursed the damaged Thunderbolt back across the English Channel and landed at his home base. Ground crews counted more than 200 bullet and cannon shell holes in the aircraft. By all conventional understanding of aerial combat, Johnson should have died. The P-47's design philosophy, armor, redundancy, rugged construction had saved his life. Stories like Johnson's reached the Pacific theater through intelligence channels and pilot gossip. Japanese analysts read the reports with mixture of disbelief and concern. The numbers seemed impossible. A fighter taking 200 hits should not fly. A pilot wounded multiple times should not maintain control. The entire scenario violated Japanese understanding of how air combat worked. But the reports kept coming, from different theaters, different pilots, different circumstances. P-47 seconds were absorbing punishment that should have been fatal and returning to base. The pattern was undeniable, even if the implications were difficult to accept. In December of 1943, Japanese Army Air Force headquarters in Tokyo convened a technical conference to review intelligence about American fighter development. Captain Fukui presented his findings about the captured P-47 from Wewak, complete with photographs, measurements, and preliminary analysis. Other officers contributed reports about encounters with P-47 seconds over Rabaul, where the 348th Fighter Group had begun extending its operations. Navy representatives shared similar accounts from Bougainville, where Marine Corps aviators flying Chance Vought F-4U Corsairs, another heavy, rugged American fighter, were achieving kill ratios that Japanese intelligence found difficult to credit. The conference proceedings, preserved in fragmentary form in post-war archives, reveal the cognitive dissonance Japanese planners faced. On one hand, the evidence of American material advantages was mounting. Production figures, cross-referenced from multiple intelligence sources, suggested that American aircraft factories were indeed manufacturing fighters and bombers at rates that exceeded Japanese capacity by factors of 5 to 10. The P-47 alone was being produced at more than 700 aircraft per month by late 1943, a figure that represented Japan's total fighter production across all types. On the other hand, accepting these numbers meant acknowledging that Japan was engaged in an unwinnable war of industrial attrition, a conclusion that clashed with national ideology and military doctrine. The conference concluded with recommendations that reflected this tension. Japanese fighter development should continue prioritizing maneuverability and climb rate, as these represented areas where Japanese engineering could still achieve advantages despite resource constraints. Pilot training should emphasize tactics that exploited these advantages while avoiding the high-altitude, high-speed engagements where American fighters excelled. Production should be streamlined to maximize output of proven designs, rather than pursuing complex improvements that might reduce manufacturing efficiency. The recommendations were logical, given Japan's strategic position, but they also represented an implicit acknowledgement that Japan could not match American material superiority and must instead seek tactical solutions to a strategic problem. What the conference could not address directly was the deeper question Fukui had identified in his report from Wewak. The P-47's design revealed an enemy with resources so abundant that it could afford to build survivability into every aircraft, to protect every pilot, to sustain operations at a tempo Japanese forces could not match. The armor, the redundant systems, the powerful engine, the heavy armament, all represented choices that were only available to a nation with effectively unlimited industrial capacity. Japan's fighters were light because Japan lacked the aluminum to build heavy ones, lacked the fuel to power thirsty engines, lacked the manufacturing infrastructure to produce complex systems in quantity. American fighters were heavy because America had all these things in abundance and could afford to prioritize pilot survival over maximum performance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The winter of 1943 brought increasing P-47 activity over New Guinea and the Bismarck Archipelago. Colonel Kirby's tactics had proven so effective that other fighter groups began requesting Thunderbolts, despite initial skepticism about the type's suitability for Pacific operations. The 58th Fighter Group, the 413th Fighter Group, and eventually units of the 7th Air Force in the Central Pacific would all operate P-47 seconds before war's end. Each group discovered the same fundamental truth. The Thunderbolt could not dogfight with Japanese fighters at low altitude, but it did not need to. Its high-altitude performance, diving speed, and ability to sustain battle damage created advantages that Japanese pilots found increasingly difficult to counter. Lieutenant Sadao Aoki, flying a Ki-43 Hayabusa out of Wewak, encountered P-47 seconds for the first time on January 8, 1944. His flight of 4 fighters had been scrambled to intercept American bombers reported approaching from the southeast. They climbed to 12,000 feet, the altitude where Ki-43 performance peaked, expecting to engage the bombers before American escorts could intervene. But the P-47 seconds came from above, diving out of the sun at tremendous speed, their 8 machine guns creating a storm of tracers that Aoki would later describe as looking like a solid wall of fire. The first pass scattered Aoki's flight. His wingman's aircraft took hits in the engine and began streaming white coolant smoke, except the Ki-43 had an air-cooled radial engine and should not have produced white smoke. Aoki realized he was seeing fuel vapor from punctured tanks mixing with the humid tropical air. The wingman's aircraft caught fire seconds later, the pilot managing to bail out before the flames consumed the cockpit. Aoki hauled his own fighter into a hard climbing turn, the maneuver that Japanese doctrine taught should force any pursuing enemy to overshoot or stall. But the P-47 seconds did not try to follow him through the turn. They simply extended their dive, accelerating to speeds Aoki estimated at over 400 miles per hour, using that speed to zoom climb back to altitude, well beyond the Ki-43's effective firing range. Aoki attempted to pursue, but his lighter fighter, optimized for turning combat at medium altitude, could not match the American dive acceleration. By the time he had straightened from his turn and pushed his throttle forward, the P-47 seconds were already 3,000 feet higher, circling lazily, waiting for him to make a mistake. He tried climbing toward them, but at 15,000 feet his engine was already laboring in the thin air, while the Thunderbolts appeared unaffected. One P-47 detached from the formation and dove toward him again, forcing Aoki to break off his climb and dive away toward the relative safety of Wewak's anti-aircraft defenses. The engagement lasted perhaps 8 minutes. Aoki's flight had been scattered, one aircraft destroyed, one damaged and limping back to base with a wounded pilot, and 2 survivors who had been unable to engage the enemy effectively. The American bombers, which had been the original objective, completed their attack on Japanese supply dumps and departed without harassment. Aoki landed at Wewak with his fuel nearly exhausted and his hands still shaking from the adrenaline of combat. He reported to his commanding officer that the American fighters possessed speed and altitude advantages that made conventional intercepts extremely difficult, possibly impossible without fundamental changes to Japanese tactics. His report joined dozens of similar accounts accumulating in intelligence files throughout the Southwest Pacific. Japanese pilots were describing the same pattern repeatedly. P-47 seconds would loiter at high altitude, dive to attack with overwhelming speed and firepower, then zoom climb back to altitude before Japanese fighters could respond. Attempts to intercept them during the dive were futile. No Japanese fighter could match their acceleration. Attempts to pursue them during the climb were equally futile. The turbo-supercharged American engines maintained full power at altitudes where Japanese engines struggled, and attempts to damage them when hits were achieved often proved frustrating, as the P-47 seconds seemed capable of absorbing damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. Flight Sergeant Takeo Nakamura, a veteran pilot with 14 confirmed victories flying the Ki-43, encountered this survivability firsthand during a fight over Alexishafen on February 4, 1944. His flight had managed to position above a formation of P-47 seconds, escorting bombers, achieving the altitude advantage Japanese tactics demanded. Nakamura dove on the trailing American fighter, achieving what he later described as a perfect deflection shot from the P-47's 7 o'clock position. His 2 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons all converged on the target. He observed strikes on the American aircraft's fuselage and right wing, saw pieces of metal tear away, watched the P-47 snap into a roll that suggested the pilot had been hit or had lost control. But the American fighter did not fall. Instead, after a moment that Nakamura found incomprehensibly long, the P-47 recovered from its roll and dove toward the deck, streaming what appeared to be hydraulic fluid or fuel, but showing no signs of fire or structural failure. Nakamura pursued, firing additional bursts that he believed scored further hits, but the American aircraft simply accelerated away from him in the dive. At 10,000 feet, Nakamura was approaching his own fighter's structural speed limits. The P-47 was pulling away, still diving, still under control. At 5,000 feet, Nakamura broke off the pursuit, his ammunition nearly exhausted, his aircraft vibrating from the high-speed dive. He watched the American fighter level out at barely 500 feet above the jungle canopy and head south toward Allied territory, still flying despite damage that Nakamura was certain should have been fatal. The P-47 that Nakamura damaged, if the aircraft could even be called damaged given its successful escape, likely returned to its base at Port Moresby or one of the forward strips Allied forces had constructed as they advanced up the New Guinea coast. Ground crews would have patched the holes, replaced damaged components, conducted engine inspections to ensure no critical systems had been compromised. Within days, possibly within hours, the aircraft would have been flying again, its pilot, if wounded, replaced by one of the growing pool of trained aviators. The Americans seemed able to produce without limit. The sortie Nakamura interrupted would be logged, analysed for lessons learned, and incorporated into training that prepared subsequent pilots for similar encounters. This cycle of damage, repair, and return to combat represented a kind of warfare that Japanese forces found increasingly difficult to sustain. When a Ki-43 took significant battle damage, it was more likely to be destroyed than to make it home. When a Japanese pilot was wounded, the replacement pilot was often less experienced than the man he replaced, drawn from a training pipeline that was shortened and simplified as the war consumed instructors and resources. Japanese aircraft production was increasing in raw numbers, but declining in quality, as skilled workers were drafted into military service, and as material shortages forced the use of inferior components. The gap between Japanese capability and American performance was widening with each month of the war, and encounters with aircraft like the P-47 made that gap impossible to ignore. Intelligence officer Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same officer who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, reviewed combat reports from New Guinea in March of 1944 and drafted a confidential assessment for Navy headquarters. His analysis noted that American fighter tactics had evolved to exploit material advantages rather than seeking the close-in dogfights. Japanese pilots were trained to win. The P-47, F-4U Corsair, and P-38 Lightning all shared characteristics that made them formidable in the vertical fight, high speed in dives, good high-altitude performance, and exceptional durability. Japanese fighters retained advantages in turning combat and initial climb rate, but American pilots were simply avoiding engagements that played to those strengths. Fuchida's report included a section on American industrial production that drew from multiple intelligence sources, including documents captured in the Aleutian Islands campaign and statements from interrogated prisoners. The figures he presented were sobering. American aircraft production for 1943 had exceeded 85,000 aircraft across all types. Fighter production alone exceeded 30,000, including approximately 4,700 P-47 seconds. Japanese production for the same year totaled approximately 16,000 aircraft across all types, with fighter production around 8,000. The disparity in heavy bombers was even more pronounced. America had produced more than 19,000 four-engine bombers, while Japan's production of comparable aircraft numbered in the dozens. But raw production numbers, as Fuchida noted, told only part of the story. American aircraft were being produced by a manufacturing infrastructure that had been systematically expanded since 1941 to meet wartime demand. The Farmingdale, New York factory where Republic Aviation built P-47 seconds had been enlarged multiple times, with production eventually reaching a peak of over 300 aircraft per month from that single facility. Additional P-47 production lines operated at Evansville, Indiana, where Curtiss Wright manufactured the aircraft under license. The total manufacturing footprint for a single fighter type exceeded anything Japan had devoted to its entire aviation industry. More troubling still was the sustainability of American production. The United States was simultaneously fighting a two-front war against Japan in the Pacific and against Germany in Europe, while also supplying aircraft, vehicles, and weapons to Allied nations through Lend-Lease agreements. The Soviet Union alone received thousands of American aircraft, including P-47 seconds and other fighters. Britain received hundreds of Thunderbolts, which were used primarily in the Burma campaign against Japanese forces. Despite this global distribution of military equipment, American forces facing Japan never seemed to lack aircraft, spare parts, ammunition, or fuel. The industrial capacity supporting the American war effort appeared functionally unlimited, capable of sustaining losses and maintaining operational tempo at levels Japan could not approach. Fuchida's report concluded with a recommendation that Japanese strategy shift toward preserving experienced pilots rather than committing them to attritional battles that favored American material advantages. He suggested that Japan's best chance for a negotiated peace lay in inflicting sufficient casualties on American forces to undermine public support for the war, rather than attempting to win through tactical or operational excellence. The recommendation was realistic given Japan's strategic position, but it also represented an acknowledgement that military victory in the conventional sense was no longer achievable. The report was classified and distributed to a limited number of senior officers. Some endorsed Fuchida's analysis, others rejected it as defeatist. None could offer a convincing alternative strategy that addressed the fundamental problem he had identified. Japan was losing a war of industrial production, and no amount of warrior spirit or tactical brilliance could compensate for the material disparity American industry had created. By mid-1944, P-47 seconds were operating across the Pacific theater in roles that demonstrated the aircraft's versatility. In New Guinea, they flew close air support missions for Australian and American ground forces, using bombs and rockets to attack Japanese bunkers and supply lines. In the Central Pacific, they escorted B-29 Superfortress bombers, attacking Japanese-held islands, operating from carriers and newly captured airfields. The long-range P-47 Newtons variant, with redesigned wings holding additional fuel, extended the Thunderbolt's combat radius to nearly 2,000 miles, with drop tanks, enabling missions over the Japanese home islands from bases on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Japanese forces faced these operations with dwindling resources, fuel shortages, limited training flights for new pilots, creating a downward spiral where inexperienced aviators were sent into combat without the skills needed to survive, were quickly lost, and were replaced by even less experienced pilots drawn from an increasingly depleted training pipeline. Aircraft quality declined as manufacturing shortcuts became necessary to maintain production numbers. The Ki-84 Hayate, which entered service in mid-1944 as Japan's most advanced fighter, suffered from chronic maintenance problems and production defects that reduced its effectiveness despite impressive design specifications. On paper, the Ki-84 could match or exceed P-47 performance in several categories. In practice, mechanical failures and pilot inexperience meant the theoretical advantages rarely translated to combat success. Captain Fukui, who had examined the captured P-47 at Wewak in November 1943, found himself stationed at a technical evaluation facility in Japan proper by the summer of 1944. His responsibilities now included analyzing Allied aircraft that had been captured or forced down in the home islands, as American bombing raids brought the war to Japanese cities with increasing frequency. In July, he was summoned to examine a P-51 Mustang that had made an emergency landing in a rice paddy near Osaka after its pilot became disoriented during a long-range escort mission. The Mustang, like the P-47, embodied American design philosophy. It was well-armed, well-protected, equipped with sophisticated navigation and communication equipment, and built to standards that Japanese manufacturers could no longer achieve even for their best aircraft. Fukui spent 2 days examining the Mustang before it was shipped to a more secure facility for detailed disassembly. The fit and finish of components, the quality of materials, the precision of manufacturing, all exceeded what Japanese industry was producing in the war's 4th year. He found himself thinking back to his observations at Wewak, to the conclusions he had drawn about American industrial capacity and strategic advantage. 9 months had passed since he had written his report about the P-47. The situation had not improved. If anything, the gap between Japanese capability and American performance had widened as American production surged and Japanese resources dwindled. He wrote a second report, more detailed and more pessimistic than the first. He noted that American aircraft technology was not simply ahead of Japanese technology, though in some areas, particularly in electronics and supercharger systems, it clearly was. The more fundamental problem was that American industry could manufacture complex, resource-intensive designs in quantity while maintaining quality, while Japanese industry was struggling to produce simpler designs with declining quality and chronic shortages. The P-47 required approximately 15,000 pounds of aluminum and strategic alloys per aircraft. Japan's total aluminum production for 1944 was projected at approximately £200 million, enough for perhaps 13,000 aircraft, if all aluminum went to aviation production, which it could not, given competing demands from other military programs. American aluminum production for the same year exceeded £2 billion, an order of magnitude larger, supporting aircraft production that dwarfed Japan's output while also providing material for vehicles, ships, and other war materiel. Fukui's report circulated through technical and intelligence channels, but generated little substantive response. By late 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where detailed analyses of American industrial advantages seemed almost academic. The Philippines had been invaded. The Marianas had fallen, bringing B-29 seconds within range of the home islands. The combined fleet had been shattered at Leyte Gulf. Kamikaze tactics, the ultimate expression of warrior spirit, over material considerations were being employed with increasing frequency as conventional air operations became unsustainable. The war was entering its final, desperate phase, and questions about why American fighters were more survivable than Japanese fighters were less urgent than questions about how to stop the American advance with the limited forces that remained. The P-47 seconds that Captain Yoshio Fukui had first encountered in the wreckage at Wewak continued flying missions through the war's final year. The 348th Fighter Group, which had introduced the type to combat in the Southwest Pacific, transitioned to P-51 Mustangs in early 1945 as range requirements exceeded what even the improved P-47 variants could provide. But other units continued operating Thunderbolts, including the 318th Fighter Group, which flew P-47Ns from Ie Shima and later from Okinawa against targets in the Japanese home islands. On May 25, 1945, the 318th encountered a large formation of Japanese fighters attempting to attack Allied shipping off Okinawa. In the engagement that followed, American pilots claimed 40 victories with minimal losses, demonstrating once again the tactical advantages that the P-47's design philosophy enabled. Japanese pilots who survived these late-war encounters described them in terms that would have been familiar to Lieutenant Aoki or Flight Sergeant Nakamura. The Americans fought from altitude, dove with overwhelming speed, struck with devastating firepower, and escaped before effective countermeasures could be implemented. Japanese fighters that managed to hit P-47 seconds during these engagements seldom brought them down. The Thunderbolts absorbed damage and continued fighting or withdrew to their bases for repair. The pattern that had emerged over Wewak in 1943 persisted until the war's final days. American material advantages, embodied in aircraft like the P-47, translated to tactical and operational superiority that Japanese forces could disrupt but not overcome. When Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the surviving P-47 seconds in the Pacific theater had compiled a remarkable combat record. The type had achieved an aerial victory ratio exceeding 4-1 in Pacific operations, despite initial predictions that it would be unsuitable for the theater. Thunderbolt pilots had destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft in air combat and thousands of ground targets through bombing and strafing. The aircraft's durability had saved countless American pilots who would have died in lighter, less protected fighters. The industrial capacity that produced more than 15,000 P-47 seconds had demonstrated American ability to manufacture complex military equipment in quantities that influenced strategic outcomes. Captain Fukui survived the war, though his technical evaluation duties kept him far from the frontline combat that claimed so many of his contemporaries. In post-war interviews conducted by American occupation authorities, he was asked about his assessment of American aviation technology and industrial capacity. He described examining the P-47 at Wewak in November 1943 recounted his observations about the aircraft's design philosophy and what it revealed about American resources. The interviewer, a U.S. Army Air Force's intelligence officer, noted Fukui's comments and asked whether Japanese leadership had understood, at that early stage of the Pacific fighting, that they were engaged in a war they could not win through conventional means. Fukui's answer, preserved in occupation records, was carefully worded but revealing. He said that engineers and intelligence officers had understood the implications of American industrial capacity as early as 1942, when the first reliable production figures became available through various intelligence channels. But understanding a problem and having the means to solve it were different matters. Japan had entered the war with strategies predicated on quick victories and negotiated peace, not on sustained industrial conflict with the world's largest economy. By the time the full scale of the disparity became undeniable, Japan was committed to a course that could not be altered without admitting defeat, an admission that national ideology and military culture made impossible, until atomic weapons and Soviet entry into the war created conditions that forced acceptance of the unacceptable. The P-47 Thunderbolt that Captain Fukui examined at Wewak represented, in physical form, the industrial and strategic realities that would determine the Pacific War's outcome. Its heavy armor revealed an enemy that could afford to protect its pilots. Its powerful engine revealed an enemy with abundant fuel and sophisticated manufacturing. Its 8 machine guns revealed an enemy that valued overwhelming firepower over elegant sufficiency. Its very existence in combat over New Guinea, thousands of miles from American factories, revealed supply lines and logistical capabilities that Japan could not match. And its ability to sustain battle damage and continue flying revealed a design philosophy that prioritized pilot survival and sustained operations over the warrior ethos that Japanese doctrine held sacred. For Japanese forces facing P-47 seconds in combat, these revelations came piecemeal a realization during one engagement that the enemy fighter could not be caught in a dive, an observation during another that hits were not producing the expected results, a growing awareness across multiple encounters that American pilots were surviving situations that should have been fatal. The accumulation of these small revelations, repeated across thousands of combat sorties throughout the Pacific theater, created an understanding that transcended any individual engagement or tactical innovation. American forces were not simply fighting better or using superior tactics. American forces were fighting from a position of material abundance so overwhelming that it transformed the fundamental character of warfare. The irony that Captain Fukui recognized but could not fully articulate in November 1943 was this: Japan had initiated the Pacific War based on calculations that underestimated American industrial capacity by margins so large that the miscalculation became catastrophic. Japanese planners had known that America possessed superior industrial potential, but they had believed that American lack of will and the time required to mobilize that potential would create a window of opportunity for Japanese victory. What they had failed to understand was that American industry in peacetime already possessed capabilities that exceeded Japan's fully mobilized war production, and that once committed to total war, American output would reach levels that made Japanese resistance strategically futile, regardless of tactical successes or operational brilliance. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its 200-hit survivability, its abundance of armor and armament, its expensive complexity and resource-intensive construction, was not an anomaly in American production. It was typical. The United States built more than 15,000 of them, while simultaneously producing tens of thousands of other aircraft types, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of weapons, and the logistical infrastructure to deploy all of this materiel across 2 global theaters of war. Japan, fighting for survival in a single theater, could not match American production in any category and was falling further behind with each month the war continued. This was the truth that combat against the P-47 revealed to those Japanese personnel who examined it closely enough to understand the implications. The aircraft's survivability, its ability to absorb 200 hits and fly home, its pilot's ability to survive wounds that should have been fatal, Its squadron's ability to replace losses faster than attrition could reduce their numbers reflected not superior engineering or tactical doctrine alone, but a war economy operating at a scale that Japan could not approach. The courage of Japanese pilots, the skill of Japanese engineers, the determination of Japanese forces to resist, none of these qualities were sufficient to overcome the fundamental material disparity that aircraft like the P-47 embodied. In the final accounting, the P-47's contribution to Allied victory in the Pacific was both tactical and symbolic. Tactically, it provided high-altitude fighter-bomber capability that Japanese forces struggled to counter, protecting American bombers, supporting ground operations, and achieving favorable loss ratios in air combat. Symbolically, it demonstrated that American industry could manufacture highly capable, survivable aircraft in quantities that made Japanese resistance ultimately futile. The 15,000 P-47 seconds were matched by thousands of P-51 Mustangs, F-4U Corsairs, P-38 Lightnings, and other fighter types, plus tens of thousands of bombers, transport, aircraft, and trainers. This avalanche of military production, enabled by an industrial base that Japan could not match, decided the Pacific War's outcome as surely as any battle or campaign. Captain Yoshio Fukui, standing in the tropical heat beside a bullet-riddled P-47 on a jungle airfield in November 1943, had glimpsed this truth before most of his contemporaries were willing to acknowledge it. The aircraft before him was not just a tactical challenge to be countered with improved training or modified doctrine. It was evidence of an enemy whose material advantages made conventional victory impossible. The war would continue for another 21 months after Fukui filed his report from Wewak, but the outcome had been determined by industrial realities that individual courage or tactical brilliance could not overcome. The P-47 Thunderbolt, with its heavy armor and its ability to survive 200 hits and fly home, was both weapon and symbol, a physical manifestation of the industrial power that ultimately decided the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.